citizens of El Reno and Canadian Valley, and also I think we could term the phrase the historian laureate of El Reno. Merle, how did El Reno come about?
Well, that's an interesting question and one that I think more El Reno people should know about. Bill, the El Reno started in 1889. At that time, the opening was held for the unassigned lands of central Oklahoma. Present-day El Reno is split north and south by the 98th meridian. And on the occasion of April 22nd, 1889, the settlers from all over the United States lined up on the west side of this line and ran east for homes, quarter sections, in this central Oklahoma area. And at that time, Reno City, which is about 2 miles north of El Reno, was platted and established as a town. At the end of the day, on that April 22nd, it was going strong and looked like it would be a future prosperous city. 2 months later, or a little less than 2 months, a group of officers of the Rock Island Railway and Fort Reno officials decided that the location at Reno City was inadvisable because of the fact that the Rock Island Railway, instead of running straight north and south through Reno City and into El Reno, swung way to the west of the 98th meridian through Concho and then down the old Kerfoot Junction and then swung into the 98th meridian in El Reno. The reason that change was made was because the towns and through which it had planned to run were attempting to charge them for the right-of-way, whereas by running through the Cheyenne and Arapaho country to the west of the 98th meridian, they would not have to pay anything for the right-of-way. So that change was made, and then it was logical that since the railroad missed Reno City, it was logical that a new city should be established at El Reno.
Well, then actually El Reno came about because of a location of a railroad per se.
That's right. And this brought the Rock Island then to El Reno in 1890. But it was in June 1889 that the city actually got its start. An old boy by the name of George Lamb had brought his plow and wagon and settled on a claim on the east side of El Reno, and they hired him then to plow the street markings for this new town. They set up a tent on the present site of the First National Bank parking lot, and they held an auction sale there for these different lots, and thus El Reno was born.
Thank you, Mr. Woods. We're speaking again with Mr. Merle Woods of El Reno. Mr. Woods, we mentioned a moment ago Reno City, prior to the actual town site or township of El Reno per se. Where was the exact location of Reno City before there was an El Reno, and is there any remains of Reno City still in this area?
No remains whatever, Bill. The schoolhouse on the highway 2 miles north of El Reno, on the east side there, is on the plat adjoining the old town site of Reno City. That is, the old Reno City was south of that location. And the town developed into quite a little burg. It actually had about 2,000 inhabitants at one time, I understand. They had a paper, a bank, hotel, and it was going strong until the first winter proved a discouraging one. The rains came, and on account of the low ground there, the settlers found it extremely difficult to get around. And so during the winter, they began moving to El Reno. There was a large hotel, the Caddo Hotel, which was moved to El Reno during the winter, and a rise came down the river at the time they were trying to cross it. They had just built a temporary bridge, and the hotel had to stay located in the river bed there for several days until the waters subsided. I'm told that the people who were living in the hotel in Reno City, many of them continued to live in it all the time it was being moved to El Reno. It was located on the corner where the Hutchins
Nursery?
no, on the corner of Rock Island and Wade, southwest corner. It became quite a hotel, added to later, year after year, until it spread out over quite an area there. It was later torn down, however. But other buildings were moved, including one livery stable, which is located across the street east from this hotel on what is now the Deathridge D's Tire Shop.
Mm-hmm.
And that was later converted into courthouse. They took the stalls out and put in some partitions, and in a very crude way built a courthouse there. And when they held the courthouse election in 1891, El Reno and Frisco City and Mustang were all bidding for it. I understand there's a lot of skullduggery went on. El Reno is claimed to have counted the number of people who were in occupying graves out here in El Reno Cemetery at the
Made it
time.
a true Old West saga then, didn't it, Merle?
That's right. But anyhow, El Reno won out in the election. They also voted a lot of workers who were helping build the Rock Island, or what was then the Choctaw, Oklahoma and Gulf, from El Reno east to Oklahoma City. They were parked, or they were camped out along the north side of town, and so many of them were pressed into service as voters.
Thank you, Mr. Woods. We're speaking once again with Mr. Merle Woods of El Reno. Mr. Woods, have you learned the origination of the name El Reno? Did it come from the fort?
Yes, sir. Fort Reno was one of 3 forts in the United States which were named for General Reno, Jesse L. Reno, and not the Colonel Reno, who had such disreputable conduct in the Custer Massacre. General Jesse L. Reno was a northern general who had won a great deal of fame in the early days of the war. At the Battle of South Mountain in the fall of 1862, he had been fighting all day and was gathered with a group of his officers when a stray minie ball hit him, and he died there a short time later. Had he lived, it's generally conceded that he would probably have been the commander-in-chief of the Union forces rather than General Grant, because he had such a fine record up to that time. And he was buried in Washington, D.C. There is an oak tree at the place where he was buried, and they have erected a monument there to General Reno, and he was a very famous general. We should be proud of the heritage and having a man like that as our namesake.
Mr. Woods, does the E.L., the L, have any prefix as far as history is concerned?
That was an unusual thing. We had a Reno City here, and we had a Fort Reno, and they decided to call this just Reno. And the Post Office Department refused to accept that, however, because of the confusion. And so there were a group of the officers from Fort Reno, and some of the El Reno officials were on their way to Fort Reno one day, driving out there, and the driver all of a sudden pulled the team to a stop and said, "Boys, I've got the right name." Said, "We'll just put L on in front of the Reno. L means the, and then we'll have the Reno." And as a result, that was adopted. It first was run together, all one word. And then in 92, I believe it was, the name was divided up, made to 2 words. L, of course, is Spanish for the.
Thank you very much, Mr. Woods. Speaking again with Mr. Merle Woods. Merle, a few moments ago we were talking about, a saga of the Old West and of El Reno, about counting residents that have been in their graves. I know you've researched this because you're certainly not old enough to have lived it experientially, but Is El Reno was it considered a western town, a frontier town back in those days?
Very much so. El Reno was known on account of the races for lands that were held here. In 1892, the settlers lined up on the east side of the 98th meridian and ran to the west. And that brought a great many people to El Reno. And then in 1901, the great drawing lottery was held for the Kiowa Comanche lands in 6 counties southwest from El Reno. And that drawing, the registration for the drawing, which lasted for 30 days in advance of the drawing, brought at least 150,000 people here for registering. Then on the day of the big drawing, something like 100,000 were present on the Irving School grounds when the actual drawing was held. They placed the names of all the applicants in a big hogshead, and they were drawn out by boys. It took several days to complete the drawing, but they drew by numbers, and then they were permitted to choose the land that they wanted, what was left. The first come, of course, were first served. The most popular sites were Lawton. There were 2 pieces of tracts of land on the south side of Lawton, both of which were very much desired. There was a girl who drew the second number. A man drew the first number, and a girl drew the second number. The girl was a telephone operator from Wichita, and so she she expected to get one of the 2 quarters on the south side of Lawton. But the man, who was pretty much of a hog, he took the strip a quarter of a mile wide and the full mile long, adjoining Lawton, and then it's necessary for her to go south of that then and take the next 8 acres or 160-acre strip. But she married a lumberman in Lawton, and they lived a very happy and useful life. The man that beat her out of the better land had a very tragic ending, I understand. He lost his land, and it never did him much good.
Thank you, Mr. Woods. Speaking once again with Mr. Merle Woods. Mr. Woods, in our previous discussions, we've brought out the cavalry, we've talked about our Indian friends, settlers, cowboys. El Reno must have been quite a historic town as pertaining to Hollywood, to a grade B movie. Was El Reno that type of a town early?
Very much so. I'm interested in the fact that, of course, there were a great many saloons, and the people were from all over the country, the adventurous type, and naturally they were the type that would speak for themselves, and they carried guns, and shootings were very frequent. I'm told that Temple Houston, the prominent
TV lawyer, if nothing else.
Yeah, TV lawyer, is, of course, he lived in Woodward, but he came here to attend court frequently, and at one time they picked on him to serve as the presiding officer of the Cattlemen's Convention, which was held at the Kerfoot Hotel. And they said that he walked in to the speaker's desk, pulled out 2 guns laid on the table, and announced that he intended to have perfect order all during the convention. And as I understand, he succeeded in that desire.
Something that might be interesting, if we have anything supporting it, Merle, in your research, do you know any of the old locations of some of these saloons, where they would be now compared to some of our businesses in this district?
I know a number of them. The location of the Patterson Drug Store was one of the prominent ones. Every one of the main corners were originally owned by the different breweries or distilleries, but the Schaefer, Mr. Henry Schaefer, formerly owned the location where Don's store is now.
Don's Bargain Store.
Don's Bargain
on
Store.
The corner, right?
And he was a wholesale beer distributor for one of the main brands for Oklahoma, and El Reno in an early day was very strong in wholesalers, and they had a great many wholesale implement houses, and as I mentioned, the beer and several other wholesale firms, groceries, so that for a time it looked as though it would be ahead of Oklahoma City. But one by one, these wholesale firms moved to Oklahoma City, and El Reno lost her position in that respect.
Thank you, Mr. Woods. Speaking once again with Mr. Merle Woods. El Reno certainly is historic as far as value is concerned to the Old West. What type of law and order did we have in El Reno?
Well, like all of the frontier towns, Bill, it was a little rough, but we did have the advantage of some of the retired officers from Fort Reno, some of the retired Indian scouts who came into El Reno and became head of the police department. And as a result, those boys were well experienced, knew how to handle affairs. And so things never did get really out of hand here. But at the same time, I know they had some wild times. I understand when Prohibition went out in 1907, they had quite a celebration. They tried to drink up all of the remaining stocks that were on hand, and that caused quite a jamboree for several days.
These lawmen, Merle, these were the old-time lawmen, a gun-on-the-hip type lawmen.
That's right. They knew their way around, too. Another interesting point in the opposite direction, we had churches come in those early days. The Methodists were here early. I had an interesting article from the first pastor of the El Reno Presbyterian Church several years ago. At that time he was living in North Carolina, and he wrote of his experiences when he came to El Reno. He landed here one day in winter and couldn't find a place to hold a meeting of the prospective Presbyterians, so he gathered a group together in a saloon. The saloon keeper kindly consented to let him use his warm quarters, and he had a big wood stove, and so they set down beer kegs with boards across them, and the people gathered in for the service, and this minister wrote that as the proceedings went ahead, almost everybody present, even the saloon people, were crying. But it wasn't on account of his words of wisdom, he went on to say, but said that they had used green wood in this stove, and the smoke was coming out so heavily that it caused everybody to weep copiously.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Woods. Speaking once again with Mr. Merle Woods of El Reno. Merle, can you tell us a little bit about Fort Reno, Darlington, Concho, how it came about, why were they here?
Yes, I think that's very interesting. Fort Reno was established in 1876. Darlington, the first Indian agency, had been established in 1869 by Brenton Darlington, a Quaker who had been sent out along with 8 other Quakers to take over as Indian agents. The nation had become rather scandalized over the inhumane treatment of the Indians in the Southwest, and so these Quakers suggested that they take over as agents and attempt to correct the situation. This was done. Brenton Darlington was sent to our Darlington agency, and in '69 he died 3 years later. He wasn't able to stand up to the rigors of the job, but as a result of having the Indian agency at Darlington, it was found necessary to bring troops in to protect against possible Indian insurrections. And so, in fact, we had a fight near Fort Reno, near Darlington, what is called as a Sand Hills fight in 1875, the year before Fort Reno was established. And in that battle, the Indians and the troops fought all day, near Darlington. The Indians had fortified themselves on a sand hill. The troops surrounded it, but during the night the Indians were able to sneak away. But as a result of that fight, it was found necessary to bring troops in for the protection of the agency, and Fort Reno then they began building it in 1876, early in the year. There were several prominent generals came. Philip Sheridan was visited there several times while overseeing the fights against the Indians in that year. And
Merle, let me interrupt just a moment here. We were actually having Indian fights in this area.
Oh yes, I should say this was one of the bloody areas. Settlers were coming in to a certain extent, and the Indians didn't mind lifting scalps. They Cheyennes and Arapahoes, of course, were roving Indians, and they were being forced out of their country. The whites were killing off their buffaloes, on which they depended for meat, and the Kiowas and Comanches were having the same troubles, and it was actually a very bloody period of time. Fort Reno is very prominent, and Darlington too, because of these Indian affairs. They brought in two girls who had been captured by the Indians. The German sisters were brought into Darlington, and actually there, at the time they were brought in, that fight, Sand Hills fight, was precipitated. They had a group of those unruly warriors were brought in, and they were putting irons on them in order to take them to prison, when one of them broke loose and ran, and one of the soldiers fired at him, and he was killed, and the other Indians then took up the fight, and that resulted in the Sand Hills fight, which was the last great Indian fight of western Oklahoma. But Sheridan came along with some of the other generals. Custer was involved with Sheridan in these Indian fights. The Battle of Ouachita out in western Oklahoma came along about that time. It was before the Sand Hills fight, but it has been called a battle. It is actually a massacre because the Custer's troops came upon the Indian camp early in the morning and slaughtered the tribesmen without quarter. But Darlington then had the Cheyenne Arapaho school for the Indian youngsters, and but in 1879 the Cheyennes and Arapahoes broke up. The Arapahoes maintained the school at Darlington, while the Cheyennes were moved to Concho. Concho was originally known as Caddo Springs. It was a very favorite stopping place on the stage trail for drivers, freight drivers, and for stagecoaches because of the splendid spring water out there. But the Concho was started is named for an Indian for an agent by the name of Shell. Mr. Shell was the agent, but they wanted to name Concho for him, but they wouldn't permit that, so they used the Indian name, the Mexican name, Concho.
Thank you, Mr. Woods. We're speaking once again with Mr. Merle Woods of El Reno. Mr. Woods, from your research, can you recite not necessarily some of the actions, but some of the duties of the fort? We know it was here to keep down the Indian trouble, but how long did this go on? Just how long was the fort active before we moved into Reno City and then into El Reno?
Well, the fort, of course, was very busy all through those early years, furnishing soldiers to help keep down Indian troubles all over the state. They took part in the Crazy Snake Rebellion, helped put it down. That is not too long ago. But in those early days, they were called upon to help round up outlaws and help round up people who were gypping the Indians. And then they leased a number of the farms in the central Oklahoma area to cattlemen. not the Indians settled on a few of those tracts, but the rest they were leased to cattlemen, and there were large ranches. The fort, the soldiers from the fort were used a great deal during those openings. They had to patrol the areas beforehand to try to keep out the Sooners. Sooners were those who would sneak in and hide in order to be on hand and stake the very best farms after the actual race started, and that's where the word Sooner became prominent in Oklahoma terminology. It used to have a great stigma attached to it, but in these later days,
something to be proud of.
That's right. Mm-hmm. But the Fort Reno soldiers were used to drive out those early attempts to colonize Oklahoma. Couch and some of those other boys who brought in colonists in an attempt to get started were arrested by these soldiers and escorted out of the territory. And altogether, they did a very useful job. But after the opening, of course, their usefulness for maintaining peace was almost over. Then came along the Spanish-American War. They had to locate a regiment at Fort Reno, and it was one of the prominent training places. Many of the Rough Riders were recruited at Fort Reno, and the regiment from there was sent to Florida. I don't believe many of them actually got to Cuba, but some did.
Well, when was the fort deactivated?
Actually, it continued in 1908. It was changed from a military to a remount station. In other words, it was set up to provide mounts and artillery horses, equines, for whatever military use it might be needed. And it was very popular as a Fort Reno, as a artillery station, that is for mounts for artillery horses, and then mounts for the cavalry. And it continued in that capacity until about the time of World War II. Early in World War II, a great many horses were purchased because even at that time, motorized artillery motorization of artillery hadn't been completed. And so they started out the war using a great many horses. They bought many horses in Spain, but a great many of them were bought and were trained at Fort Reno and shipped overseas for military use both in World War I and World War II. Soon after the start of World War II, however, they decided that mules were much better than horses for military uses, and so they held a big sale at Fort Reno. In 3 days, they sold some 7,000 horses there, and that was quite an event to see. They were replaced then with mules, and then they decided that by that time motorization of artillery and all other equipment had proceeded so rapidly, they decided that it was unnecessary to have the mules and horses any further. And so they practically did away with that part of the station. However, they then decided that they would train mule pack trains for use in India and Burma, and in the rough country in those areas. They also used some of them in Italy. But those pack trains were set up at Fort Reno. They brought the horses in there. They were raw, untrained, and then they'd bring in the recruits who knew nothing about horses, and they'd marry them out there. And it was quite a sight to see those boys knew nothing about horses, and the horses that knew nothing about being trained, had no training whatever, no break-ins. And so they had quite a group of cowboys to assist in breaking them. And then these recruits would take them over. In about 3 months, they would train a complete pack train, ship them out to India, and from there they went into action. And they proved to be very valuable fighters, and they helped save that area.
So actually, the old Fort Reno had a history during the wars that we are now familiar with,
Very much so.
not
That's
only in the
right.
past of the old, but also in the present.
That's right. They trained a great many men in World War I. However, it is still more or less of an equine station then. But in World War II, they not only had these pack training groups, but they also trained a large group of veterinarians and others. So that it was, there were some 2,000 military men stationed there during World War II. So it made it a very active place. El Reno was hopping on Saturday nights when those troops had come to town.
Thank you, Mr. Woods.